Hello, my name is Brendan Decora, and I want to welcome you to my podcast, Pro Audio Profiles. Here, I'm going to interview recording engineers, mixers, producers, and others in the pro audio field. Together, we're going to learn how you can make amazing records that can give your listeners goosebumps. Welcome to the show. I'm excited to present the very first episode of the show, featuring Ken Sluiter. He's a multi-platinum engineer, producer, and mixer who's worked with the likes of Morrissey, Weezer, and Jerry Lee Lewis, among many more, of course. Let's get started. Today, I want to just talk about how to create magic in the studio. And I know as an engineer and producer, that is an unanswerable question. Like there's so many different variables, and also I know that you engineer and produce. And how does that vary if you're engineering? What do you kind of do to help the artist with that versus producing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a timely question because for a long time I didn't take any producing gigs. I mean, not that my phone was ringing off the hook or anything like that. I just didn't sell my services as a producer. When I lived in Chicago, I produced a lot of indie stuff, and that was in an era in the 90s. My exposure to what an engineer-producer was almost one and the same thing. You know what I mean? Because that was all my producer heroes, the Butch Viggs, John Agnello, all these people, they were all engineer-producers. So it was sort of like the same job in a way. At least that's the way I saw it. And then when I moved to LA, I just was trying to find as much work as I could. So I thought to myself, if I want to get hired by producers, maybe it's not the smartest thing in the world to sell yourself as a producer. And this is still in the era of the engineer-producer era. But just recently, I've started getting back more into producing proper. And now I kind of have a different perspective over it as far as what the roles are. And if I was to summarize it into one sentence, the engineer is responsible for the recording, the producer is responsible for the record. Right. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
The producer is responsible. Well, for one, there's an inherent conflict of interest when you get hired as a producer, because usually it's the band or the act picks you to produce them, but it's the label or the management company or who's ever financing it is your client. And sometimes the band wants one thing and the client wants something else.
Right.
And you have to figure out a way to serve both of those people at the same time.
Exactly.
So that's true of, I think that's always been the case. That's not new. But in general, I find that if I'm hired by a producer to engineer, I'm not really hired to be creative. I'm hired to be resourceful. And there's creativity within that resource, but you're not the one that's collaborating with the artists. Maybe on a sonic level you are, but it's a dance that you do,
right? Because
some producers want the engineer to get really involved, really deep into the weeds of the chords, and here's the arrangement. Some producers don't want you involved at all in that kind of stuff, just focus on the microphones and the sounds.
Right. And how does it vary when an artist is producing themselves and you're kind of co-producer and working with them, and you're not so much concerned about a label or someone, an artist that's more independent?
That's a good one. I mean, I feel like any artist who's made a couple of records is just the de facto co-producer. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's one thing if a band comes in, or a band or an act comes in and they've never done this before, and you're going to be the one who's going to guide them through the whole process. That's probably not production, but at a certain point, their creativity and what they're bringing to the table as an act is beyond what you would expect of an act. Now they have opinions about what studio we're going to record in, how we're going to do it. Now they're your co-producer,
of course.
And if you're the engineer if you're hired to engineer in that capacity, you're kind of the de facto co-producer as well, whether you're getting hired to be that or not. You know what I mean? And well, that's just a tricky dance as well, because for one, have you ever shown up for a session and you talk to the engineer and he's like, well, I'm really producing, but I'm only hired as the engineer, and you're just like, oh boy, we've all been there 1,000 times. Right. You know what I mean? I think that now, I'm old enough and I've been doing this long enough where I try to avoid as much as I can getting into the situation where you're hired as one role, but then you get into it and
Right.
every ship needs a captain.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And oftentimes you get hired to engineer, you realize that they don't know what they're doing, and they knew instinctively that you were the safety net, and then now you're resentful because you're either A, not getting credited for the production work that you're doing, or B, not getting paid as a producer,
Right.
But at the same time, I would also say that, I mentioned, my wife is a photography producer, and so for her, that's putting together budgets, hiring crew, getting permits for locations, doing estimates. And granted, and a record producer doesn't have to get a permit for a location. Like, some of this stuff is very admin stuff, but in general, unless you can hire a admin person to handle it, you are actually doing, I just did a thing I was producing, and it's like I spend more time. Well, not more, but you're spending as much time making sure everyone's parking is sorted, that there's a hotel room, you know what I mean? That, where's the bathroom? Oh, we'll ask the producer. I mean,
Right.
You've been there and you see it happen. And
well, so that's a common thing is people confuse production with the creative versus the logistical side.
Yeah.
And there's so many people that, say, oh, I'm a producer, and then they write the track and do all the creative stuff and forget to the whole other side of it, of booking the studios and scheduling and arranging musicians and all that kind of stuff.
For sure. Well, and the other thing is that I think that, rather than being like the old man, get off my lawn mentality of that's not a record producer. I myself have had to redefine what a record producer is. And I don't mean this with a tone or a negative tone, but we're in an era now where if you make a beat, you're a producer.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And I just, in my opinion, a producer either is someone who started out as an engineer or a writer producer, which there's always been, Smokey Robinson, you know what I mean? Like from the get-go, there's always been writer producers. And then there's this sort of, I'm a record executive, but I'm a producer. The Ted Templemans, you know what I mean?
Right.
The guys who kind of they're coming at it from the label point of view, and all those people, I envy their careers because and I could go on and on about Ted Templeman, but well, first of all, he was a musician, he was in a band, had a good ear, but I think that there was an era of record making where the producer would either be hired by the label, or maybe they would even help you get signed, do your demo, help you get signed. But there was a lot of trust involved. The artist would show up, and if the artist knew, is my understanding, for example, the Van Halen, Ted Templeman scenario is that those four dudes just wanted to, if they thought Ted liked it, they knew they were in good shape. You know what I mean?
Right.
Whereas now, sometimes you get hired to produce, and it's I want you to produce until I don't like what you're saying anymore, and then I'll just pull the next guy in. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
And that's a tricky thing because the thing is that unlike being an engineer or unlike being a piano player, you could go around and say you're a piano player all day, but if you sit at a piano, and someone says play me some piano, if you can't do it, you're not a piano player.
Right.
You know what I mean? Whereas a producer, if you sit back on the couch and read the newspaper and everything goes smooth and that's a hit record, then you're a good record producer. Even if you didn't do anything other than hire the engineer.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So in other words, there's no...
Yeah.
But
that is a key choice. It's half of production is knowing who to hire for the job.
Right.
Whether it's a session musician or the engineer, it's all about that.
And there's a lot of stuff. For example, there's some really good session players I know that if I hired them on my session, after take 4, they go, we got it. And I'm like, no, I don't think we have it. And so I got to find the person that has the chops that I want them to have. But at the same time, if I'm still searching for something and I don't think they have it, they're not going to dismiss me. You know what I'm saying? So I need to find those musicians that are in that sweet spot. Sometimes you hire these guys and they show up and they're just Russ Tittleman never asked for 4 takes, and it's well, I don't know what to say, man. You know what I mean? Right. Here we are.
Right.
I don't think we have it yet, Right. So that's hiring and to your point, putting the right team together is a bold creative choice in and of itself. Yeah, for sure.
So as an engineer, like obviously you engineer and you're a mixer as well. When you're engineering, is there any certain workflows or methods you use to help people get great performances? A lot of it is all in the preparation, but is there anything in particular that you can think of?
Well, I think, preparation is a really good thing. For example, and I mean, you and I have been assistants together, and we've watched the whole setting up a session. If you're working for the studio, you want to have everything ready to go to the best of your ability before the artist walks in the room, because you don't want to control the session creatively, but you want to have a handle on what's going to happen.
Of course.
And if the artist comes in and you're not 100% set up yet, even though they might change everything, then they get the momentum of the session. You know what I mean? And now you're reacting to them as opposed to being one step ahead of them. You're one step behind them.
Right.
So as an engineer, you kind of want to be one step ahead. You know what I mean? Like, we're going to set up this microphone here because I think that the guy's going to want to do a final vocal, you know what I mean? And maybe we won't use that microphone, but why not just get it set up, just sort of thinking two steps ahead. I think that helps. I think getting a great headphone mix really helps. One thing that I like to do, which is, and I think I'm lonely with this, is once we get into overdubs, I just want to give them my mix. You know what I'm saying?
Right. I do that too.
And if I need to give them a mix of something that's odd, that's going to help them perform better with some weird little mix, and then that's what we're going to listen to in the control room. Because I feel uncomfortable sending them a mix that I can't hear and monitor myself. And when I say good headphone mix, I don't just mean like a good balance, but I mean, we're talking from an engineer's point of view. That means having a great sounding headphone system.
Right.
Which are fewer and farther between now, as we've gotten headphone mixes that have more routing flexibility. They don't sound as good as the old school giant power amps, like powering headphone systems to make the headphones sound great, so that when the singer is singing, they feel like they could sing as loud as they want because their headphones will go as loud as they need to go.
Right.
You know what I mean? If when the singer's singing, when they hit a certain point and their headphones start folding, you're not going to get a good performance. It's distracting.
They're going to be scared to project,
to open up. Yeah. So I think that kind of thing is really important.
Yeah.
I think like having pencils and colored, and paper handy. I mean, this sounds like, that's sort of the assistant's job, but it's the engineer's job to make sure the assistant has done their job.
Right.
Making sure that you have water,
warm water, even like a tea setup or something.
Tea, throat lozenges, all that kind of thing. But then the other thing that I really think matters, and this is with all performers, is looking at what you want to do and breaking it down into like manageable like chunks of stuff. You know what I mean? Like, for example, if you have like some world-class singer, like Aretha Franklin level person, they might want to come in and they're looking to perform the entire track in one go, right? And you might get a second take.
Right.
You know what I mean? And you might not. And then you have certain singers that you come in and it's like, we're going to record this section by section, and the pre-chorus doesn't even matter. You know what I mean? In other words, all we care about is this verse melody. And then we're going to just focus on this verse melody. And then once we get the first verse, we're just going to move right over to the second verse. I don't even want you to hear the pre-chorus. I don't want you to hear the chorus, because the chorus is in a different key. If you keep hearing that chorus in your headphones, well, say, for example, I mean, this is radical, and this is sort of, you got to know what kind of artist you're working with. Am I working with the kind of artist who's going to sing this thing from top to bottom, or are we going to craft this little by little? Sometimes if you're working with a younger band and you have a singer who's like a little pitchy or just tentative about their performance in general, like some of the little tricks that I'll do is, say the verse is 16 bars long. You have a verse part 1, verse 1A, verse 1B, right? But the intro of the song is in a different key than the verse. But they're going to come in on the downbeat of that verse. Right. But they're hearing a different key, and then they start singing, they're in a new key. Well, you need to give them pre-roll, right? You need to give them pre-roll. And what's happening is that their brain can't get into that whether it's a chord or key. So sometimes what I'll do, and this is crazy, is I'll say, I want you to sing the first half of the first verse in the second half.
Right.
So that way your pre-roll is still in that same key signature, so they're still getting into it. Or I'll say, listen, I want you to sing the first half, if I mean, this is getting really like technical, but say the first verse is 4 lines. I'll say, I want you to sing lines 1 and 2 and then sing lines 1 and 2 again.
Right.
And all we care about is those 2 lines. You know what I mean? And what'll happen is the first one's a warm-up, and then they nail it on the second one, and then when they're gone, you just move all those over, and you build your comp.
Exactly.
Whatever you need to do to get the performance. And it might seem like tedious and like you're making more work for yourself, but it's a lot less work than trying to melodyne a performance that isn't there.
Right.
Not that we won't go look at melodyne and do all that stuff as well down the road.
And even like the intensity level too, like you said, you do, verse 1 and then skip the chorus and go to verse 2, like another reason, even if it is in the same key, like let's say the chorus is much louder, they're way more
taxing on their voice.
It's like you want to just keep them in that chill vibe,
right?
And that similar sort of, mode so that they don't get, all out of whack with it.
And then once they get into the chorus, which is usually like the most exciting part, and it's usually 9 times out of 10, like in a higher register, their voice is warmed up, and they know, like, hey, we've already got all the verses. We got the pre-chorus. All we got to do is just nail this one little bit. And sometimes I'll do a thing where, and I do this with musicians a lot too. If we have 4 lines, I'll say do lines 1 and 3, 5 and 7. Just do 1, 3, 5, and 7. Okay, now we're gonna go do lines 2, 4, 6, and 8. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I do that with myself when I'm overdubbing on stuff playing bass or guitar. If suddenly I'm like, oh, this is what I want to do, I don't have the chops to do that. I go, okay, well, there's this A riff and the B riff. I mean, the most classic example of that is there's this producer, engineer, producer, mixer, songwriter guy named Phil Thornley, English guy. He was the bass player in The Cure for a while, and then he was the engineer of Duran Duran's Rio. So he was like a guy who was just deep into it.
Yeah.
And he was like on a podcast or something, and he was talking about, like, I'm the bass player on Love Cats. And he said, and they wanted to do it on an upright bass, and I have never played an upright bass before. And so when I got it, I just, on one track, I went, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, dun. And then on the next track, I went, don't, dun. And when you put the two together, it's just funky, like New Orleans, almost like level, like wow, listen to that groove.
Nice.
From a dude who had touched the instrument before,
right?
But he knew how to organize himself and sort of say, like, this is what we need to do to get this track. You know what I mean? And I think that a good producer knows, like, okay, this is a person who's just going to perform it down. This is a person that we just need to craft it. You know what I mean?
Right.
And it's frustrating for me if I'm with a musician and they're like, oh no, man, I just want to do it. I just want to do it as a performance. And you're like, we've done that 4 times. Like, and what's happening is, well, like, you never hit the first note of the chorus correctly because you're out of breath because the verse was a mouthful.
Right.
You know what I mean? I mean, you've seen all this
like
stuff,
that
right?
happens all the time. Yeah. So then what about, I mean, obviously we both worked at a variety of studios, and, not everyone has the budgets or ability to work in all the best studios.
Yeah.
What are some considerations when you have to work in like a subpar studio?
I think the biggest consideration is, I'll say this, like, when I'm working in an A-level studio versus like a cheaper studio, it's more to do with how long is it going to take me to get the good sound. Like, we'll get the good sound,
right?
But how long is it going to take me? You know what I mean? Will the artist tolerate, like, I mean, this is such a cliche, but for example, it's like, okay, who's the artist I'm working with? What's the bathroom look like at the studio? Like, how's the parking at the studio? I mean, all that stuff, when you're producing, it really needs to be considered. How far away is it? You know what I mean? Is there food around? Can the studio bill the label for the food? You know what I mean? Like
Right.
if you work at a studio where they go, we don't handle any of the food stuff at all. We don't put a budget together. Well, that's fine for an indie rock thing where everyone's just going to go grab some burritos at the food truck. But if it's the kind of thing where it's like, no, like these people want to eat like proper food. I got 6 people in the room. We need it's going to be like $300 a day in food.
Right.
If they're not willing to put that on the bill and bill that to the label, then we're not going to work at that studio. I mean, it's really that simple, you know? So there's all that, but a big part of it is that, you know, in an A-level studio, like the expectation is you walk in and you're ready to go. Mm-hmm. So like if you have an 11 a.m. downbeat, the engineer can show up at 10:30, walk around, make sure everything's good. And by 11, like we're rolling,
You can
you
hit
know?
record then. Yeah.
Right. In a smaller, sort of lower budget studio, it's, you know, the clutches on the mic stands don't work and you know, and stuff like it's the little things.
A bunch of little stuff.
And they all add up. And if you're going to camp out like in a studio like that for 2 weeks doing guitar overdubs, which I haven't done in a long time, people don't even have the budgets to do that kind of thing anymore. Then that's no problem. It's like the whole first day, you're just going to be sort of working out the kinks and getting it together. But then once you're settled in, it's cool, you know? Gear doesn't matter as much anymore because you can bring in some gear, you know what I mean? Or, you know, I mean, in living in LA, you know, you can rent, if the studio doesn't have a 47, it might be cheaper to go to a cheap studio and rent a 47 than to go to a big studio. Although that being said, I mean, the rental houses aren't what they used to be. I think maybe the pandemic has made it worse, you know, but it's, you know, I think that when I moved here and when we've been here roughly about the same time.
At the same time, yeah.
Anything you needed, you could have in about an hour.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You could have
even
delivered.
that has changed a lot.
Yeah.
It's like if it's after 5 o'clock, they're all closed. You can't get nothing.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So again, you have to plan more. I find like if I mean these are the funny things. If a studio has weird air conditioning, which all studios do, I've never been in a studio that I wasn't constantly, you know what I mean? But like, you know, when you're recording a lot of guitars, that becomes a consideration. You know what I mean? Like,
that's true.
Like the room that we're in now, every morning I got to heat the room up, and it takes about an hour before these guitars really settle in where they're happy. You know. And if you're recording like a string session, you know what I mean, like a string quartet, then that really, really matters.
Absolutely.
You know? But they all have their place. I would say that, I mean, the sort of I guess they used to call it project studios or stuff. I think those studios seem to be in the most fear of going extinct, just because people can do so much out of their house.
Right.
You know what I mean? You can do so much now just in your home, you know? So,
well, like you said, no one even has the budget for a guitar overdose because you can go home and do that.
Yeah, you can go home and do it. And there's some plugins that sound really good now, you know what I mean? And if you disagree, you're not paying attention. You know what I mean? That's the way I feel about it. You know, I considered, like, am I going to build a little booth here for vocal overdubs? First of all, you know, guitar overdubs. Well, I don't really care about guitar overdubs because I'm probably gonna, if I'm cutting guitars here, it's probably gonna be just directly into the computer, because it's gonna be more about crafting something, as opposed to like, if it's some hot shit guitar player, then we're gonna go book a room. You know what I mean? Then we're gonna go book a room. You know, and vocal booths sound terrible to me. You know what I mean? Yeah. If you put a really nice microphone in like one of these like vocal booths that people build in the corner of their garages, it sounds terrible. Like, why wouldn't you? And I feel like if I'm cutting vocals in here with the singer, it's because, again, we're crafting it, and there's going to be a lot of, hey, try this, and the less we're pushing buttons and talking to each other through headphones, the better it is. That said, I have had a couple artists who they like the booth. Like, they like to feel
like the separation.
They like to feel like they can just be alone in their own thoughts. And so that has its place, you know?
Yeah, for sure. You've been doing more Atmos projects recently, and I'd love for you to touch on that. I know it's a new world and ever changing. But if you want to touch on that.
Sure. I mean, in general, well, I mean, to preface that, I would say that in my indie rock world in Chicago, even though this wasn't the way, by the 90s, it was very much like there was starting to become like superstar mixers. You know what I mean? Like your Andy Wallace's and Clear Mountain and the guys who just mixed.
Right.
But in my little world, a little indie rock band would come in and we would record and mix the record often in one session, you know? And so I was always like a bit of a mixer, but not really a mixer.
Mm-hmm.
But in 2014, I started working with Joe Ciccarelli on that Morrissey record. And it was like, he's like, I have to have this thing turned in like a week and a half. Like, I need you in one room. We had another guy in another room. And it was like 4 mixers all like putting this record together. And so he just started sending me stuff to mix. And so I started really focusing on mixing. And I never had made the decision of like, I'm a mixer now, I'm not an engineer. But slowly over the years, I'm like, hey, I'm recording drums like less. I'm spending less time in the studio.
Right.
And so then when the Atmos thing came along, which I'm still even now I'll get to exactly my role in it in a bit. But it was certainly, I was hearing examples that I thought were impressive. I was hearing some things that I didn't like at all. But the thing for me is that if I identify as a mixer, and not even like A-level mixer or B-level mixer, but just somebody who like that seems to be how I'm staying busy, and here's this new music mixing format, I just want to be a part of it.
Right.
You know what I mean? I just want to be a part of it. I don't want someone else to Atmos mix my original mix if possible.
That's my worst fear, honestly. That's partly why I started doing it too, is because I realized that it's, you know, if you have an iPhone with the AirPods, that's the default setting on Apple Music.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing you hear. And if my name is on a mix and someone else did the Atmos mix, it's like,
and it's bad.
Yeah, I got to make sure.
Exactly.
Good.
And I got to say that it seems like more and more there's starting to become more like a list of more impressive Atmos mixes are starting to happen.
Right.
Are starting to emerge. Where I've been staying busy is actually doing like rebuilds for other people.
So you're that guy.
I am
the Atmos mix.
I am ruining the Atmos mix. Yeah. Blame me. Well, I like to think that I'm part of the solution, not part of the problem. I mean, but part of the problem is not just anyone. And I'm not saying that like I'm the guy and no one else can do it. That's not the case. But not everyone can rebuild a mix. And I think that part of why I seem to be doing okay with it is, I would like to think that like I'm young enough that I'm still interested in the new technology, but I'm old enough that if a record comes in from 1992, I can kind of imagine what environment that thing was mixed in.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So I'm not going to put like Soothe on all the tracks, like to recreate something from the 90s because they didn't have that capability.
Right.
You know what I mean? So say if a catalog mix comes along and I have to talk generally because a lot of these things aren't released. A lot of them might not get released, so I can't really name names. But if a catalog mix comes along, I'll look up like an SOS article or a Mix Magazine Classic Tracks article and try to understand like what studio it was mixed in, who mixed it. And, you know, if it was from 1980, I'm going to say, okay, we're going to use chambers and plates. You know what I mean?
Right.
If it's from 1986, we're probably going to use a little bit of lexicon.
Right.
If it's
some AMS.
and some AMS, and you start using period-specific things.
Right.
If it's mixed on an SSL, then I'm going to only use SSL plugins. You know what I mean?
Right.
And SSL console emulation, and you do all that stuff. There's a lot of unique things about the rebuilding process that things that I've learned. For one, any production that involved an analog transport, you're going to need to vary speed the multitrack to match the mix.
Huh.
And we've always thought that analog is, you know, in other words, digital is as perfect as it gets. It's like it's like an atomic. Everyone has an atomic clock running their digital machines. In other words, you could have one digital machine and a separate digital machine running on their own clocks, recording the same audio, and you could let them run for hours, and then if you put those audio files into one of them and line them up, they'll probably null and stay nulled for days.
Right.
That's just the nature of digital.
Exactly.
Analog, in the course of a 4-minute song, they start drifting.
Mm-hmm.
What's unique is you think of analog transports as like drifting in and out, but it's always drifts in one direction. So the point is that you identify what the first moment of the song is on the what we call the comparison master, which is the stereo mix that you're trying to recreate, and then you identify the last moment, and then you very speed it.
Right, so that those two moments line up.
So those two moments line up, and then you play them back against each other until it's like this giant.
Nice.
And the interesting thing about it is that isn't just about keeping it in time, but now your EQs and everything are so much closer. In other words, if something is like a quarter step off, you might not hear it as a pitch difference. It'll just sound duller than something a quarter step running faster. It's not only the pitch is raised, but it sounds brighter. Right. And so right off the bat, you're that much closer to matching the original
That's interesting.
mix. But there's also challenges about, for example, a lot of mixes. The mix is done, and then the mix might be edited a few times. You know what I mean? Where they go, hey, I don't know why, but the second chorus feels better than the first chorus, and they grabbed a razor blade and they chopped that in. Well, you have to account for that too. You have to make the Atmos mix has to match the original comparison master, and it has to match it sonically, and then it has to match it timing wise as well. So I've done a lot of those where I'll do that, and then I'll just print a bunch of stems and then send them off to somebody to spatialize them, and or maybe I'll even start spatializing, and then they'll fine tune it. Which I'm glad to do. It's definitely become interesting, and it's definitely opened my eyes about like that. A lot of records that sound like there was a lot of time spent in. I think my favorite era of music is a ton of time spent crafting the production, but the mixes came together pretty quickly. And you can hear that because it's not as hard to match it once you sort of make your little plan, know what I mean, and have a little strategy, stick to it. It comes together pretty quick. I know I had the chance to hang out with Bob Clearmountain in a private situation, and of course he was nice enough that I felt like, hey, I'm going to ask him some questions. So I had to ask him about Avalon, and I'm like, hey man, I heard that you were mixing 2 songs a day, and he said, yeah, we mixed 2 songs a day on that record, and he goes, and also the studio had like night sessions, so we had to be done at 7:00 every night. So he was spending about 4 hours, and he said, I think we went back and maybe recalled one of them and did a new mix. And this record that is sort of the benchmark for so many people is like an excellent sounding record.
Right.
The guy was doing these mixes in 4 hours. I mean,
well,
that blows my mind.
Like you said, though, if there's a certain era where they spent most of the time in the studio getting great recordings, getting great references and great rough mixes. And so a lot of the times the mixer doesn't even do that much. Yeah,
he's sort of just finalizing it, finding the... Well, and that's the one thing I'll say for anybody who's I mean, I think all of us are... I'm working more than ever with people who are self-producing and doing it all at home, right? And, which I enjoy doing. I'm glad to do. You know what I mean? But if your rough mix sounds terrible, it's because your production isn't together yet. Right. You know what I mean? Like your rough mix, you should be able to, like, I mean, this sounds ridiculous to say, but you should be able to start your song and end it. And if you feel like you're constantly wanting to hold the faders, move them around, you haven't cracked the code yet of your production.
Right.
And some of these rough mixes I get are insanely bad. It's like you don't even know what you have. How can you even know what you have? How did you know this is ready to send to the mixer with this rough mix?
Right.
And
well, part of it too is people, that's the extent of their skill level.
Well, yeah.
And so they need someone else to, bounce ideas off of. And obviously, we're both mixers, and like I know I get files that are all over the map. Some sound really great, the roughs, and some really don't. But, the client is clear, like, hey, I know this isn't a great rough. please don't use this as any sort of example. Here's a reference track that I want to achieve. Let's go, feel free to make drastic changes and we'll go towards that.
Yeah. Well, and that's fair. And that's fair. I mean, I think we've talked about this before, even is on this specific topic, but it's a tricky thing because you have to manage your expectations, but at the same time, it's like I'm not here to tell you that it can't be everything you want it to be. I'm here to try to make it be everything that you want it to be. But it is sort of like when you hear it, you go, okay, I got some work to do here. Yeah. You know what I mean? I'm going to have to really roll up my sleeves.
And it's also, I always make it very clear that, how much the client actually likes their mix. Because there's some people that love their mix and it's not very good at all.
Right.
And so then it's like, okay, well, I can't really take it as far as I want to because I know that they're really attached to it and they don't want to lose that vibe. So,
yeah. It's a hard thing. Well, and sometimes they're hearing something that you're not, and they're not wrong. You know what I mean? Like I've had situations where, you were working with me on I can say this because it was a long time ago, but I was on that B-52s thing, right?
Uh-huh.
And it's such a fascinating band because as we were doing the little mix, Fred says, "Oh, the vocals aren't right. The vocal blend isn't right." And in my mind, it seemed like Kate was like the more schooled, like pleasant singer, and Cindy was more of the vibe singer. So in my mind, it was make Kate louder, and then so you have the good singer loud, and then bring in the vibe singer just to add a little vibe to it.
Right.
And he kept saying, "No, that's not right. That's not right." And so it was literally push the faders down again, try to reset my brain, and then just out of desperation, I made Cindy the loud voice, and then I blended Kate into her. It was like make the vibe the thing, and then blend in the good voice. I mean, they both have good voices. I'm not saying, but and he's like, "That's it."
Right. Because that's what they're
about.
Used to, yeah.
And he knew it. And he knew it. And then you think to yourself, like this guy who's kind of like the carnival barker of the band, who seems like he's like he is. He's like the party MC guy on stage or whatever. But he knows the balance that it needs to be. He knows. He's telling me when it sounds like the B-52s. Right. That was an amazing. And the point being is that every now and then it's really easy to go like, oh, here's this track that I don't understand at all. I'm going to turn that way down, and then come to find out that track should actually be the loudest.
The main thing.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's the thing that people want to hear.
Exactly. I just want to take a quick break and tell you about my free guide detailing my techniques for recording huge snare sounds. Check it out now at brandondecora.com/huge snare. And now back to the show. So is there any recent or current projects that you can talk about that you want to mention?
Let me see. What have I been working on? That's a great question.
I know you mixed the last Morrissey record. I know that's not super recent, but
yeah, that was unfortunately that record was released in March of 2020. Okay. And so, like, the tour behind it got canceled, and no people couldn't go out to not that people go out to the store to buy the CDs, but it was sort of the last thing on people's mind. But that's a record that I'm proud of, and that was, Joe Ciccarelli produced that record, and the thing with him is that his rough mixes come in, and it's sort of the opposite of what we've just been talking about, where the rough mix, it might not, oftentimes his roughs, if you just juice them up a little bit, you're like, this could be a final mix, But more than anything, what it does is it tells you, like, here's the point of view of this production here.
Right.
You know what I mean? And then you listen to it and you go, and you think to yourself, oh, this sounds so good. And the way he produces is it's all baked into the tracks. You know what I mean? So in other words, I've never had a project come in sounding so finished, and then you open it up and there's like a reverb on the vocal and like a little bit of delay on the vocal, and everything else is just some tracks. There's not a bunch of plugins on everything. There's almost never any plugins on anything.
Right.
And so you think to yourself, well, I'm going to have this thing done in an hour. It's basically done. And I've tried that, and that doesn't work. so the thing is you go, okay, well, what can I do to make this even better? And so what it is that it's not one or two big things. It's 1,000 tiny little things.
Right.
It's just a thousand sort of like, well, let me see. Maybe if I take some of the cymbal bleed out of the tom microphones, I can make the drums just a little bit punchier. Like, so what you're trying to do is you're just trying to improve 100 things by 5%. Next thing you know, you're like, yeah, this took me all day to do. You know what I mean? Like, this is no shortcuts to it. You still got to do the work. You just have to identify what it is and make sure that you're not screwing up the thing that was always working, and that was the way that record had gone. And that's the way, like, a lot of things that he had done, that I had done with him, sort of semi-recent stuff is the Licorice Quartet stuff that, I worked on with Roger Manning and Tim Smith and Eric Dover. Those were 3 of the 4 Jellyfish guys. And I think that the last thing that we did, it was like 3 EPs and it was released as an album. And that just came out last summer. And that's work that we're proud of. And that was very much brick by brick crafting. You know what I mean? That was very much just sweating every detail and just taking time. You know what I mean? And it was... It kind of wore us all out, but we're proud of it. But again, there was just no real shortcuts, and I say that, and sometimes, have you ever been on a session where the band sounds so good off the floor, you go, God, we're almost done. Like we're almost there. And so it's sort of like you can get 80% of it sometimes off the floor.
Yeah.
But then to get the next 20% to get it across the finish line is brutal.
Right.
I'm producing a record for an artist named Louise Aubry. This I'm literally working on now, and she had done. I had mixed her last record, and I was referred to her. Boz Borer from Morrissey's band had produced some of her previous records and introduced us, and then she wanted to make her LA record, and so we did that. So I got 4 guys at East West, and. Did that session there, and then now I'm just doing a couple little guitar overdubs and keyboards, gonna do vocals and mix, and
cool.
That's a good. But earlier when you mentioned it, when you were asking like the difference between engineering and producing, it's funny because my mind went right to that project because I get these tracks back, right, and they sound great. They should. It's Studio 2, right? Yeah. But there was. One song where I'm like, that's snare drums. What's going on there? So I start combing through the takes, and it's like, take 1, snare drum sounded good. Take 2, snare drum sounded good. Take 3, halfway through the take, something's jacked, and it's changing. It's like,
oh no.
And at that point, I was so deep into like. Making sure that everyone was hitting the right chords and, hey, play this fill here, do that or whatever, that we did 4 more takes with this snare. Well, and the funny thing is in that studio, the snare drum could be fucked up, but everything still sounds so fucking good that you might not notice.
Right.
But had I just only been engineering that session, it's like an engineer will often be like, oh, the band's getting good. I think we're close to getting the take. Hey, let me hear that snare drum. Okay, everyone ready for the next take? Yeah. Hey, let me hear that snare drum real quick. Okay, cool. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I didn't do that.
Right.
On one song, and then the funny thing was I had asked the drummer. I said, hey, the drummer has access to like a studio. I just said, hey, I'm going to tempo map this, and can you just replay these drums? And he sent them back to me, and I'm like, no, I think I'm going to go with the broken sound. The broken sound sounds better, and of course, I'm going to, add samples in and do whatever. You got to do a little repair, But that was the funny thing is that there was just a couple things that once I get the tracks home and I'm listening to them and I'm listening to them with different ears and I'm not looking at everyone tapping their foot or getting excited, and I listen to it and I go, oh, I could have made a better recording here, or that's,
Right.
I mean, there's pretty huge bumper rails at East West, and
yes.
all these A studios is kind of what you're going for. Is
exactly.
Is that
that's what you're paying for?
Is what you're paying for? Is like, hey, even if this stuff like gets fucked up sounding, it's still going to be better than you're going to get almost anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
And that's and it's also, and you can relate to. I think we've talked about this before, but just the concept of I like everything going through the same preamp and EQ. You know what I mean? I think that my favorite records are the records made where it all comes into the desk. Yeah. It's all being recorded, more or less the same. This whole, like, I like this preamp for the hi-hat, but this is my favorite one for acoustic guitars. And then for the bottom snare, I don't think that way at all. Right. I just, and so I do like to work in those rooms where everything is, and I know that, like, if you were setting up an external mic preamp in Studio 2 or any of the rooms we worked at East West, one could maybe make the case of, like, my vocal chain is something that needs to be portable and travel with or whatever, like those instances. But in general, it's not the kind of studio that you need to even bring in any gear,
right? Yeah, the consoles are so great that it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
yeah.
And I'm trying to bring in less gear. The more I do it,
right?
And use less of it even in the room. I can tell you. I mean, this is for engineers, right? This topic.
Yeah.
I very rarely compress the kick and snare drum to tape, and just for whatever reason, I felt like doing it on this project, and it sounded good, right?
Yeah.
Now I'm in there and I'm working on it, and I'm like, yeah, that cymbal's a little loud in the snare drum. I should put a gate on that. I can't gate it the way I normally would, right, because there's so much
compressed.
because it's already compressed, and I like my compressor in the box, and I thought to myself, like, that was like a pure pressure thing of I'm sitting in the room going, like, God forbid we don't run signal through that 1176 sitting there. Oh, I'll just put the snare on it. And it did sound good, but now I hope you like that sound because that's what you're going to get.
Yeah.
And if you want to gate it or if you want to get it punchier sounding, whereas the last record I had done that I cut drums on, on the Licorice Quartet record, we had done it on an API. And for whatever reason, I didn't compress the close drum mics because I normally don't. And on that record, a lot of it, there's no samples at all because I was able to get the kick and snare right where I wanted to because I still had a little bit of control.
Right.
And so as much as I admire and for as many years as I sort of like get the thing sounding like a record onto the computer, and that is true. But there are a few things now I'm starting to kind of go, you know what? Some things are
right. You want the flexibility later.
Yeah, I might appreciate the flexibility of a few things later, and that's one of those.
Cool. So there's a couple quick questions just to wrap up.
Yeah.
First one is, what is your most influential teacher?
Okay. Oh, there's no short answers to any of my questions.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
For you and your listeners. Okay, well, I will tell you this, that anyone who knows me or any of the other podcasts, the three biggest influences of people that, as far as working in a studio, like assisting, Jim Scott, Don Smith, and Joe Ciccarelli. Those three dudes are like, everything is like, what would Jim Scott do here? Boom, boom, boom.
Rightly so.
What would Don Smith do here? But as far as actually, because I did go to Columbia College in the 80s, from 88 to 92, graduated in 92, and there was this teacher, and his name was Malcolm Chisholm, and he never gets mentioned in the history of recording, but he was, I think he'd been a recording engineer starting in the 50s.
Wow.
He started out in the Navy and was like a ham radio operator, repair guy, and then segued into recording studios. He was a chief engineer of Chess Studios in Chicago, recorded Maybelline. So he was like talking to us, and he said, the students, and he's like, "You guys like rock and roll?" And we're like, "Yeah." And he's like, "I was in the room when it was invented." We're like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "Have you ever heard Maybelline?" And we're like, "Chuck Berry's Maybelline?" He's like, "Yeah." He's like, I did that. Now, and then he moved. He worked with Bill Putnam at Universal in Chicago, moved to LA and helped him get United and Western up and running.
Right.
Worked around here for a while, and then moved back to Chicago. Worked some more at Chess, some more at Universal, made a bunch of records. But he was the guy that, like, he would say to us, and this is like, just to give it some context, this is like 1988, right? So it's, the era of like Motley Crue, gigantic drum sounds and everything like that. And he'd say, so to be a professional recording engineer, you want to know how long it should take you to get like drum sounds? And everyone's like, well, it's been like a day and a half or 2 days. He said, how about 16 bars? He said, when I was recording records, and he's mentioning like Dinah Washington, Willie Dixon, Frank Sinatra. He said, like, you got those drums sounding good, like right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's the sort of era that he was from. And all my other teachers were like guys who were like dicking around with MIDI and or guys who had worked in recording studios for a few years, got burnt out pretty quick, and then immediately like pivoted into academia. You know what I mean? And everyone's like, "Oh, Malcolm's a kook" or whatever. I'm like, but Malcolm did it. You know what I mean? He did it for real. And I have to mention, he was the guy who in the 80s was describing to me. Back then there was no inline consoles. There was the recording side of the console and then the playback side of the console. And he would line up all of his playback faders at 0. And then all of his recording faders were all over the place.
Yeah.
And he didn't see that anymore. And I would talk to engineers throughout the 90s or whatever. And then finally a couple of the guys who knew what that was about said, well, you don't really do that now, because now you're sort of printing every track to what's the best signal to noise ratio.
Of course.
You know what I mean? And once we hit 2-inch 24 track, you couldn't do the straight line thing anymore, because if you didn't want the hi-hat loud, you needed to turn it down on the playback side. Otherwise, you had a whole bunch of tape hiss.
Right.
Well, now we're in Pro Tools land. Now the monitor faders being at 0 is very relevant again.
Absolutely.
Because you're not dealing with tape hiss. And to this day, and it was like a light bulb moment for me. And now I see everyone does it. That's just the default setting. When you're starting a recording session, those playback faders should all be at 0. So you're building the mix into the multi-track.
Right.
And that's the way that this guy worked throughout the 50s and 60s. Nice. And he just had a lot of like little things that he would say that, well, for example, he's describing like a FET limiter, blah, blah, blah. And what we didn't realize is he was describing the 1176. And he was saying, here's the problem is that vowels are about 15 dB louder than consonants. And in his mind, and in Bill Putnam's mind, that was like, how can you get a lead vocal to park on top of a mix when you have one level for the vowels and another level for the consonants? And so they came up with the 1176. Right?
That's crazy.
Now we all think about that. Now we just compress vocals because that's the sound. But they were literally like trying to fix a problem, and to this day, that's really what it's about. Yeah. And so things that he said to me, I'm still figuring out what he meant. Yeah, for sure.
Nice.
So Malcolm Chisholm, look him up. There's a little, and he also became a studio designer, and he had a lot of like just sort of really good common sense ideas about like how to make a room sound good. You know what I mean? Without over absorbing it. You know what I mean? And things that today, when I first walked into what was cello, but I was like, this is what this guy was talking about. Like everything in all the rooms, I'm like, this is the right amount of diffusion, some absorption, tile floors, all this stuff was exactly what he was talking about.
Nice. So the next question should be an easy one, hopefully. Your favorite reference track when you're going to a new studio or need to reference on a mix or something?
It's kind of funny, but it was Back in Black for like everyone else for a long time. As glorious as that track is, I don't think it has the low end in it by today's standards.
Right.
So I think it's kind of a toss up between Madonna's Music and No Doubt's Hello Good.
Nice.
Just because those fill the speakers, they fill the room. They're just beautiful, beautiful mixes that are really aggressive sounding, but not like don't hurt your ear. You know what I mean? And they sound good on my speakers.
Right. I mean, there's no right answer. Like, as you know, once you learn what something sounds like, that's all that matters, and you can gauge anything on that.
I just know that I get like a funny look if I'm like recording some like aggressive rock band. I go into the room and suddenly they're hearing like boom, 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 coming out of the control room, and I'm like, sorry, man, this is what I use, or if I want to see, like, okay, like if I'm in a cheaper studio and okay, I'm going to turn up the volume to where I think it's rocking in the control room. And then I'm going to go stand in the live room and see how much, see how well this build out is.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
How much bleed is in there?
Just because you got to know, hey, I think we need an NS10s for the vocal. When we cut vocals, I think we can't listen on the big speakers. You know what I mean? And or even in here, that's what I turn on and I go walk around my yard and I say, do you think the neighbors are going to mind this? Because this is about as loud as this would ever get. You know?
Right.
So yeah, those are my.
Okay.
How about you? I got to know yours.
I actually there's an Australian band named Carnival.
Okay.
And they have a song. It's called New Day, and it's a rock song, but it has a lot of parts in it where there's a really mellow intro and really quiet part. Then it gets super big and loud in the chorus and other sections, and
so it's kind of got all the.
It's got all the things.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of low end. It's got I'm really familiar with it, so I know where things should be sounding. Once I go to a new spot.
Yeah.
So
and what speakers do you like? I know that this isn't on. We're going off track.
That's fine. I am currently using Focals.
Okay.
I like them a lot. I have the Trio 6, I believe.
Okay.
Trio 8. I don't know which one it is.
Yeah.
But they're the ones with the 3 drivers in it.
Okay.
And I like them a lot because you can hook a foot switch in the back and turn off the woofers. And so it just
turns them into oratones.
Turns them into oratones or NS10s.
Yeah.
It's just the little, 4-inch mid-range and then the tweeter, and that's all you're listening to.
Nice.
And I use those with their sub, and the sub has the same feature where you can hit a foot switch and bypass the sub.
Yeah.
And so I can go from the sub and with a 3-way and big, beautiful sound, couple foot switches, and I'm essentially listening to oratones. So.
Wow. Yeah, that's. I don't think that there's no right or wrong speaker choice. It's like me telling you you might like Adidas and I might like
exactly.
Nike. These are what fit my feet well. You know what I mean? I think what I don't do is I don't switch monitors very often. In other words, once I get on a pair, I really stay with them for a long time. You know what I mean? And it is the only thing that I really bring with me anymore. I always have to have my monitors unless it's a quick 3-hour vocal session. I'm just going to use whatever they have, you know?
Cool. Last question, just to wrap up. What is one tidbit you would have for an upcoming engineer?
Well, to really stick with the engineering side of it, I think it takes 5 seconds to know what's good gear, right? You know, something based on API or Neve, more or less, get a good chain, and better to just have one really good one,
right?
Than a bunch of okay chains, right? And then from there, you should just, as far as gear goes, just instruments. You know what I'm saying? Having good instruments is more important than having good microphones and good mic preamps. Just have one good chain, and then just focus on what's coming out of the speakers. Right. You know what I mean? And don't. All these magazines are trying to sell you something. You know what I mean? All these websites and magazines are trying to sell you something. You need to spend a little bit of money on some software and then just make it work and go to town. Right. That's that's my honest to God.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for listening to the show. As you know, I'm just getting this started, and I'd love your feedback on how I'm doing, if I should keep this going, what your thoughts are. Feel free to visit proaudioprofiles.com and send me a message. Until next time.